beat me in chess and I'll marry you." Choi Moo-jin said it without looking up from the board. The room laughed. Of course it did. 40 guests, crystal glasses, a penthouse 60 floors above a city that had long since learned to stay out of this family's way. A woman in a cleaning uniform standing beside a side table studying an abandoned chess position was the funniest thing they had seen all evening. Not because she was doing anything wrong, because she existed in that room at all. Jacinta Okeke looked up from the board. She looked at him. She set her tray down and sat. The laughter thinned. "You play?" Moo-jin said, less a question than a re-examination. "Yes," she said. He sat across from her. His expression said this would be over in 4 moves. He picked up a pawn. She watched him the way she had watched the board. Still, completely without performance, they played. The room rearranged itself without deciding to. Conversations dropped. People drifted closer. His stepmother Hyun-ja materialized at the edge of the gathering with a smile that hadn't reached her eyes since the 3rd move. Seo-jun stood with his arms crossed, watching his brother's face with the specific attention of someone trying to read weather. By move 6, Moo-jin had stopped treating it as entertainment. By move 9, the room had stopped laughing entirely. By move 10, he knew. He saw it coming the way you see a door closing, and that half-second before the lock catches when you understand it is already too late. He watched her hand move across the board, watched her set the bishop down in the only square that mattered. "Checkmate," she said it quietly. To him, not to the room. 1 second, 2, 3, 40 people holding their breath behind him. Then his stepmother laughed, high and bright and slightly too loud. "Well," she raised her glass toward the table. "I suppose we'll be needing a wedding gift." The room broke open with relief. Laughter, applause, someone making a joke about prenuptial agreements. The anxiety of the last few minutes dissolving into noise. Moo-jin did not laugh. He looked at the board for a long moment. Then he stood, turned to his senior attorney and said in the same voice he used to close 9-figure acquisitions, "Prepare the paperwork." Mr. Beck's smile disappeared. "Sir, marriage registration, full asset disclosure, is standard documentation." Each word flat and final. "Have it ready by morning." The laughter stopped. All of it, simultaneously. His stepmother's glass came down on the table. "Moo-jin." The warmth had left her voice completely. "That is enough. I made a promise. You made a joke. I don't joke about promises." He looked around the room slowly at every face that had been laughing 30 seconds ago. "Everyone in this room heard me say it. He beat me in chess and I'll marry you." He turned back to Mr. Baek. "She beat me." Seo-jun moved in front of him, lowered his voice. "Listen to me. You had 3 scotches, you lost a game, you said something stupid. Nobody here is going to hold you to." "I hold myself to it." "Moo-jin." "Move, Seo-jun." Seo-jun stared at him, searching for the version of his brother he knew how to argue with, not finding it. He stepped aside. Moo-jin walked out, and the door closed behind him with a soft, definitive click that was somehow worse than any slam. The room did not move. Then every head turned to her. Jacinta had not moved from the chessboard, hands folded, back straight, face completely still. Inside her chest something was happening that had no name yet, not triumph, not terror, but something with the texture of both. The feeling of a floor giving way and discovering mid-fall that you cannot yet tell if you are falling or flying. His stepmother's voice cut through the silence. Sharp, controlled. Who authorized her access to this floor? Nobody answered. Then someone said it. Not her name, not her position, just one word dropped into the room like it was supposed to settle everything. Maid. Jacinta heard it, heard all of it, the murmuring. Hyunja's clipped instructions to Mr. Bayek. Seojun's low urgent questions near the door. 40 people quietly reconstructing an evening that had just become something none of them had prepared for. She looked at the board one last time. Her bishop, his king. 11 moves. She stood, smoothed her uniform, picked up her tray with the slow, unhurried motion of a woman who had decided long ago that no room, regardless of what it contained, would ever see her hands shake. "Excuse me," she said, to no one, to all of them, and walked back to work. Behind her, the room erupted. She did not turn around. She moved through the door with her tray and her $200 monthly rent and the straightness of a spine that understood one thing clearly. Dignity is not given by rooms like that one. It is carried in. By morning, she would be Mrs. Choi. By morning, every person in that room would be moving to destroy her. And the woman who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility was about to discover what happens when the most dangerous family in the city decides you can no longer be ignored. Before we go further, stop for a moment. If this opening already has something sitting heavy in your chest, you're exactly who this story was made for. This channel is built for people who understand that power without principle is just cruelty in a suit. If that lands, you can hit subscribe now and take a side in the comments. Would you have run or stayed? Because Jacinta's answer might surprise you. The announcement hit the family like a stone thrown into standing water. The ripples were immediate, violent, and spreading. His stepmother, Choi Hyunja, was the first to act. She had been married to Moojin's father for 11 years before his death, long enough to accumulate significant influence over the family's financial infrastructure, long enough to understand exactly how to make structural damage look like concern. She requested a private meeting with Moojin within the hour. He gave her 7 minutes. "This is madness," she said. She did not sit down. She stood in the middle of his office with that particular energy of a woman accustomed to winning through elegant persistence. "You cannot marry a cleaning girl because of a chess game." "I can," he said without looking up from his documents. "And I intend to. The board answers to the company's performance, not my personal life. Your personal life is inseparable from Hyunja." He looked up then. His voice was entirely level. "I didn't invite you here to change my mind. If you have business concerns, document them formally. If you came here to express personal objections, we're done." She left. Seojun arrived 20 minutes later. He was different from his brother, louder, warmer, accustomed to sliding through tension rather than standing in it. He sat in the chair across from Moojin's desk and stared at him for a long moment. "Are you doing this to make a point?" Seojun asked. "I made a promise. You make promises in boardrooms all the time and find legal language to soften them. Not verbal promises, not in front of witnesses." Moojin turned a page. "She won fairly. I don't punish people for beating me." Seojun leaned forward. "She's a maid, Moojin. She's a mathematician who's currently working as a maid." Moojin finally set his pen down. "There is a difference, and I suggest you learn it before you say something to her that you can't take back." Seojun left less certain than he arrived. Meanwhile, Jacinta was standing in her apartment having a different kind of conversation with the attorney, who had appeared at her door at 9 in the morning carrying a leather briefcase and a look of professional neutrality that she suspected took years to develop. "He's serious," she said, not as a question. "Mr. Choi is always serious," the attorney said. She looked around her apartment, plastic dining table, old couch with a throw blanket hiding a broken spring, the sink that leaked slightly unless you turned the handle at the right angle. 3 years of careful, disciplined survival in approximately 500 square feet. "What do I get?" she asked. The attorney blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "What are the terms? What does he want from this arrangement?" She crossed her arms. "I assume there's a document. Outline the document." He was quiet for a moment, then he opened his briefcase. She read every page. She asked specific questions about 3 clauses. She struck out one paragraph entirely and wrote her own replacement in the margin, and the attorney photographed it and sent it to Mu-jin. 30 minutes later, her version came back. Approved. Something shifted in her expression when she saw that. Not softness, not relief. Just a very small recalibration. The wedding was arranged in 48 hours because Mu-jin moved at the speed of decisions already made. There was no engagement dinner, no venue debate, no flowers chosen from a catalog. There was a judge, a room, 2 witnesses neither of them had strong feelings about, and a suit he already owned and a dress she bought from a shop 3 blocks from her apartment for $200 because she refused to let his money purchase anything that touched her skin before she had decided whether to trust him. She looked composed in photographs. She was not composed. She was running calculations. The family escalation in those 48 hours reached a temperature that required management. Yunja moved quickly, freezing access to 3 company accounts linked to Mu-jin's operational budget, framing it as a routine audit that had nothing to do with his personal decisions, which fooled no one. Board members began making calls to one another. The family's senior attorney received 14 separate inquiries in 24 hours, each one asking some variation of the same question. Can this be stopped? Seo Jun told a cousin that Jacinta must have done something, and that women like that didn't get into rooms like theirs without a strategy. The cousin told someone else. The rumor reached the media in a mutation. Maid allegedly used chemical influence at family gathering. It was in print within 30 hours. Jacinta read it on her phone while sitting in the back of the car Mu-jin had sent. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she put her phone face down on the seat and stared at her hands. She had nice hands. Her mother used to say that. Long fingers, good for piano, good for surgery, good for things that require precision. She had used those hands to clean other people's houses. She thought about that for a moment, not with bitterness exactly, but with the specific steady gaze of a woman taking inventory. Mu-jin came to her apartment the evening before the wedding. He had not called ahead. He knocked, which surprised her. She had expected the kind of man who opened doors with codes rather than knuckles. She let him in, yet he stood in the center of her living room and looked around with an expression she couldn't categorize. He wasn't performing neutrality. He was genuinely processing. He moved toward the single chair near the window, the wooden one she'd bought secondhand, and sat down. The chair made an ominous sound. He shifted slightly. The chair shifted more. For 3 seconds, they both waited. Then the leg gave entirely and he went sideways fast, catching himself on the windowsill. He ending up standing again with a controlled expression that had nevertheless cracked slightly around the edges. She looked at him. "I've been meaning to fix that," she said. "It's fine," he said, with the careful dignity of a man who had just been defeated by furniture. "That's why," she said, "we don't lean on unstable things." Something moved behind his eyes. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He stayed standing. She sat on the couch, and they looked at each other across a room that smelled of rice and something floral she burned to cover the dampness from the leaking sink. "Do you want this?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "No," she said. "I don't want a war I didn't start. I don't want a family that already hates me. I don't want to spend the next months proving I'm not something I never was." She paused. But I won't run from it either. I don't run from things. He nodded slowly. Then why, she asked, and I want the real answer. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I said it in front of people who expected me to take it back. I don't take things back. That's about your pride, she said, not me. Yes, he agreed, but the terms I sent you, the modifications you made, I approved them. She waited. That told me something, he said. What? That you're not here for money. He met her eyes, nor I would have known it by now. She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked away toward the window. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving forward without permission. I want one thing, she said. I want to be spoken to like a person in that house, not managed, not positioned. Spoken to. I can do that, he said. Whether he meant it, she didn't know yet. The wedding the next morning was quiet in the way that loaded rooms are quiet. The judge was efficient, and the witnesses were silent. When Moo-jin placed the ring on her finger, she noticed his hand. It was steady, deliberate, the practiced hand of a man accustomed to executing decisions without trembling. But for one small moment just before the ring settled, his fingers hesitated. Not long. Not visibly, perhaps, to anyone but her. She filed it away. His father's longtime advisor, a soft-spoken man named Director Kwan, who had served the Choi organization for decades and wore his loyalty like a well-pressed suit, appeared beside her during the private reception that Moo-jin insisted on despite the family's mood. He was perhaps 65. He had kind eyes. He called her daughter just like that, naturally, as though they had always known each other. You must be overwhelmed, he said gently. I'm managing, she said. He nodded approvingly. You'll need to. This family is a current, not a pond. You must learn to read it, or it will carry you somewhere you didn't choose. He touched her arm lightly. You need allies in this house. Moo-jin won't always protect you. He's not built for protection. He's built for strategy. She looked at him. He had a face that inspired trust. The kind of face that arrived at its warmth through apparent suffering, through earned understanding. She believed him because he seemed to believe himself. He said a few other things over the following weeks. Small things, inserted at the right moments, about Moo-jin's emotional distance. About the women who had come before her in less official capacities, who had each eventually found that his attention had a shelf life. He never said anything alarming enough to challenge directly. He was too careful for that. He simply left small stones in the path of her thinking and let her walk on them. She didn't tell Moo-jin about the conversations, and she processed them internally, the way she processed everything, alone, in sequence, until the sequences started to form a shape she didn't like. Moving into the Choi penthouse was an experience she was not prepared for, and she would not have admitted that to anyone except possibly the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Park, who appeared to find Jacinta's adjustment both touching and quietly hilarious. The closet was the size of her entire former apartment, and she stood in it the first morning and felt briefly dizzy. A stylist had been arranged. Jacinta told the stylist what she liked and what she wouldn't wear, and the stylist, to her credit, adjusted without drama. Dinner the first night involved 4 pieces of cutlery she couldn't immediately identify. She picked up the wrong fork. A young household staff member started to correct her. Mrs. Park materialized from nowhere and gently redirected the staff member to the kitchen, and the panic alarm incident happened on the 3rd day. She was trying to figure out the bathroom panel, which looked like the control system for a small aircraft, and pressed a sequence of buttons that immediately summoned 2 security personnel who arrived outside the bathroom door at speed. I'm fine, she said through the door. Protocol requires visual confirmation, Mrs. Choi. She opened the door in a bathrobe, holding a face cloth. Einan stared at two very large men holding earpieces and expressions of professional gravity. She stared at them for a long moment. "The buttons," she said, "are labeled in Korean." "Yes, ma'am. I want them labeled in English as well." "We'll see to that, ma'am." The next morning the labels had been updated. That small thing did something to her. She wasn't sure what. The curtain remote happened a few days later, and she was sitting in the main living area when the curtains began moving on their own, controlled by a panel she had not noticed. She watched them with open puzzlement. Moo-jin came in, read her expression, and explained. "There's a remote for the curtains," she said. "Because effort is inefficient," he said with the specific confidence of a man who had never questioned that logic. She looked at him. "You married effort," she said. Something happened to his face again, in that near smile that didn't quite arrive. But it stayed longer this time. He remained emotionally distant in the ways that mattered. He was present. He was not absent. He appeared at the appropriate time, said the appropriate things in public, and conducted himself toward her with a formality that was neither cold nor warm. Just precisely calibrated like everything else about him. She found herself trying to find the cracks in the calibration and not finding them. And the political alliance dinner came 3 weeks in. Her name was Lee Yeon-soo. She arrived in a dress that cost more than Jacinta's first year of salary in this country, and carried herself with the specific assurance of a woman who had always been considered appropriate by people who defined appropriate. She had history with Moo-jin. Everyone at the table seemed to know that history. No one acknowledged it directly, which is how you know a thing is significant. Jacinta was not insecure, as she was practical. She understood power dynamics, and she understood what she looked like beside the collected elegance of the family's preferred vision for Moo-jin. But she had been managing her responses to hostile environments for years, and she was good at stillness. What she wasn't good at was incomplete information. She passed the doorway of the smaller sitting room near the end of the evening and heard laughter. Moo-jin's voice, lower than usual. Yeon-soo's voice, lighter, not intimate laughter. She didn't know that because she didn't hear the context. She heard the sound of two people comfortable with each other in a way she and Moo-jin were not yet, and she walked past without slowing down. She did not ask him about it. She went to bed early and lay in the dark and let the conversation with Director Kwon about shelf life replay itself without her permission. When Moo-jin noticed her withdrawal the next morning and asked, she said, "It's nothing." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that said he didn't believe her. He didn't push. She interpreted his not pushing as confirmation that he didn't care enough to push. He interpreted her silence as evidence that she had no investment in the marriage beyond its terms. They were both wrong, but the distance had begun. She started spending time with Mrs. Park not because she had no one else, but because Mrs. Park was the only person in the building who treated her like a continuous human being, rather than a variable in someone else's equation. The older woman had worked in the Choi house for 19 years. She had watched every version of this family at its best and its worst. She did not gossip. She observed and occasionally commented, and her comments when they came landed with the specific precision of someone who had earned the right to them. "You think too much alone," Mrs. Park told her one afternoon, setting tea in front of her. "That is a dangerous habit in a house full of people who are also thinking alone." Jacinta wrapped her hands around the cup. "He doesn't talk to me. You don't talk to him. I speak to him constantly. Speaking and talking are not the same thing." Mrs. Park sat across from her without being invited, which Jacinta appreciated. He was raised not to need things. He does not know how to knead things out loud. Even if you wait for him to open the door, it will stay closed. She paused. But that is also not your obligation. I'm only telling you what is. Jacinta stared into her tea. What was he like before? She asked. Mrs. Park was quiet for a moment. Precise, she finally said. He has always been precise. But there was a period years ago when he laughed more. Before his father got sick. Before the weight became his alone. She refilled her own cup. He gave a puppy away once. When his father said it was a distraction, he gave it away without saying anything about it. But I saw his face the day it left. Jacinta said nothing. He stores things, Mrs. Park said. He does not discard them. That night, Jacinta took out her budget notebook, the one with the color-coded columns, and sat at the small desk in the corner of the bedroom. She didn't open it. She just held it. It was the most herself she had been in 3 weeks. Mu-jin came in, saw her sitting there, and stopped. What is that? He asked. My budget notebook, she said. I've kept it since I came to this country. He looked at it for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. He said, I looked up your university, your department ranking. She looked up. Top 8%, he said. In the year you graduated, she said nothing. I'm telling you I know, he said, in case you thought I didn't. He went to his desk and opened his laptop. She looked at the back of his head for a long moment, then opened her notebook, and for a few minutes they sat in the same room, each doing their own quiet thing. And it was the most peace she had felt since walking through his front door. It didn't last. The encrypted email surfaced on a Tuesday. It appeared during a board meeting she had been asked to attend, a symbolic move on Mu-jin's part to establish her standing. And that was already tense before it began, because Hyunja had spent the intervening weeks working the room quietly, placing doubts like furniture in a hallway, arranged where you'd walk into them in the dark. The board member who presented the email did so with the careful theatrical neutrality of someone who had rehearsed the presentation. A message apparently originating from a device linked to Jacinta's IP address, sent to a secured channel associated with the rival Shin organization, and the content suggested an exchange of information about the Choi family's internal restructuring schedule. The room went very still. Jacinta felt the stillness land on her like something physical. She looked at Mu-jin. He was looking at the document. His face was the controlled, recalibrated face she had seen at the chess table. But his eyes, when they moved briefly to hers, were something she had not seen in them before. Doubt, not certainty, not accusation, just doubt. Which is sometimes worse because it means the verdict hasn't arrived yet, but the trial has already begun. He did not defend her immediately. She waited 3 seconds because that is how long it took her to be certain she had not misread the moment. She had not. He looked back at the document and said to the board, I'll review this personally. That was all. The room exhaled. She sat very still for the remaining 20 minutes of the meeting and said nothing, which took a quality of discipline she had not previously been required to produce in a single sustained effort. When they were alone, the confrontation happened in the study, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked over the city. She stood near the door. He stood near the desk. You didn't defend me, she said. Not with tears, not with raised volume, just the factual statement of a woman recording what had happened. I didn't accuse you, he said, and that isn't the same thing. I need to verify the information before you married me, she said. You stood in front of a judge and put a ring on my finger, and a board member puts a document on a table, and you look at it like you're deciding whether I'm a stranger. Her voice stayed level. She was proud of that later. You married me, but you don't trust me. He met her eyes. I trust evidence. She looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than its seconds. Wrong answer, she said. She moved to the guest suite that night. He did not stop her. The guest suite was smaller than the main bedroom by about a third, which still made it the largest room Jacinta had ever slept in alone. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and did not cry because crying required a kind of release she wasn't ready for. And release required believing the worst was over, and she did not believe that yet. She thought about Lagos, about her mother's kitchen, either which smelled of groundnut oil, and the specific warmth of a gas burner that had been running since before Jacinta was born. About the chalkboard in her classroom, the rows of students who had groaned at simultaneous equations, and then lit up when they finally understood them. About the precise moment understanding arrived on a young face, that small widening, that breath. She had been good at producing that moment. She had been good at teaching. She was not sure what she was good at now. She took out her budget notebook. She didn't open it. She set it on the nightstand and looked at it until her eyes stopped burning. And then she lay down without changing her clothes and stared at the ceiling until the city outside the windows turned from dark to gray. Mujin sat in his study until 3 a.m. reviewing the email forensics himself. Not because he doubted her exactly, but because doubt is not a switch you turn off with willpower. It is a current, and it runs until you find its source. He found 2 things that night. First, the metadata was slightly wrong in the way that professionally fabricated evidence is always slightly wrong. Not wrong enough to announce itself, but wrong in the small technical corners where authenticity lives. Second, and more importantly, he found himself making a list. He did not mean to make the list. It assembled itself. She had asked for the contract terms before agreeing to anything, and she had struck out a clause and written her own. She had asked what she was getting, not what she could take. She had lived in that apartment for 3 years, and the only thing she owned of any value was a mathematics degree she was not using. She had never once in the weeks since entering his house requested money beyond what the arrangement specified. She had not complained about the family. She had not maneuvered. People who were extracting information for rival organizations did not behave like that. They behaved differently. He had seen enough betrayal in his life to recognize its posture. It had a particular kind of performance to it, an excess of warmth in the right places, a careful attention to access points. Jacinta had none of that. She had distance and pride and a budget notebook with color-coded columns. He sat with that for a long time. In the morning, he stood outside the guest suite door for 90 seconds before walking away. Mrs. Park found Jacinta in the kitchen at 6:15, which surprised the kitchen staff, who were not accustomed to finding Mrs. Choi standing at the counter making her own tea. Jacinta was not in the mood to explain herself to anyone. She nodded at the staff, made her tea, and carried it to the small breakfast area near the garden window. Mrs. Park followed without being asked, in which was by now a pattern Jacinta had stopped resisting. They sat. "He didn't defend you," Mrs. Park said. "No. He will regret that." "He doesn't regret things," Jacinta said. "He analyzes them." Same conclusion, different process. Mrs. Park wrapped her hands around her own cup. He sent a message to his attorney at 2 a.m. requesting the email forensics report be expedited. Jacinta looked at her. "I don't listen at doors," Mrs. Park said. "I simply notice things. I've had 19 years of noticing." She paused. "He's looking for the truth. He's just looking in the wrong direction first." "He should have looked at me first," Jacinta said. "Yes," Mrs. Park agreed. "He should have." There was no defense of him, no softening of the fact. Jacinta appreciated that more than she could articulate. "I want to go back to work," Jacinta said suddenly. Mrs. Park raised an eyebrow. Not here, not cleaning. She set down her cup. I need to think, and I can't think in a building where every room has someone else's agenda in it. I want a tutoring arrangement, mathematics. I'll find the students myself. Mrs. Park looked at her steadily. He may interpret that as... I'm not asking his permission, Jacinta said. I'm telling you because you'll hear about it anyway. Mrs. Park almost smiled. I'll make sure there's a car available. She found 3 students within the week, and 2 were secondary school students whose parents had responded to a discreet listing she'd posted through a private tutoring network. The 3rd was the 22-year-old daughter of a board member, which Jacinta had not known when she accepted the inquiry, and which she refused to reverse when she found out, because reversing it would have been exactly the kind of small strategic retreat she had decided she was done making. It was during the 2nd week of tutoring sessions, in a study room she'd arranged at a public library 2 kilometers from the penthouse, that she noticed something. She was working with her laptop open between sessions, running through her email, when she saw a notification she almost dismissed. A calendar sync from the household management system she'd been given access to, one of the administrative tools Mujin's team had set up for her. The notification flagged an anomaly in device access logs. Something small, something that would have meant nothing to most people and meant everything to someone who had spent 4 years teaching logic to teenagers. A device had accessed the household network on the evening the email was sent. The device ID was logged. She wrote it down. She did not tell Mujin. She thought about telling him. She held the decision in her hands like a stone, testing its weight, examining its edges. Then she put it in her pocket and kept moving. If she told him, he would take it from her. He would hand it to his security team and she would become a recipient of the outcome rather than an architect of it. She had spent 3 years being a recipient in other people's buildings. She was done. She began working quietly. Meanwhile, across the penthouse, the family's campaign against her continued with the patient efficiency of people who had been fighting internal wars for years and understood that erosion is more reliable than explosion. And Seo-jun had not been actively hostile, which distinguished him from Hyunja but did not make him an ally. He moved through the conflict with the careful neutrality of a man who was waiting to see which direction would cost him less. He had grown up in the same cold house as Mujin, had absorbed the same lessons about love being leverage, but had responded by becoming gregarious rather than controlled. He was likable in the way that people who need to be liked tend to be, which meant his warmth was genuine and his loyalty was contingent. He appeared in the doorway of the library one morning when Jacinta was working, which surprised her because she hadn't told him she would be there. "You're not what I expected," he said, which was not an apology but was adjacent to one. "I know what you expected," she said without hostility. "You expected someone who would break down crying and go home." He sat across from her without being invited. She noted that the men in this family were incapable of asking permission to sit. "The email was planted," he said. She looked up. "I didn't know when it happened," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I heard the theory that you were manipulating him and He stopped. "I didn't investigate. I preferred the simpler version." She held his gaze. "Who?" she said. "I have a strong instinct," he said. "Not proof. Instinct isn't useful to me." "I know." He leaned forward. But I wanted you to know that I'm not trying to remove you anymore." He said it with the specific discomfort of someone who was not accustomed to admitting they had been wrong and was doing it anyway. "I don't know if that matters." "It matters a little," she said. "Not a lot, but a little." He almost smiled. She she thought briefly that in different circumstances she might have liked him. The board meeting 3 weeks after the email incident was supposed to be a routine quarterly review, and it was not routine. Hyunja had used the interval to construct a case, not dramatic, not theatrical, but steady and technical, framing Moojin's decisions over the past several months as evidence of destabilized judgment. The marriage was Exhibit 1. The internal security incident was Exhibit 2. There was no Exhibit 3 yet, but the implication was that the series was ongoing. Jacinta attended because Moojin asked her to. He said it simply the morning of, standing in the kitchen in a way that felt unusually unguarded for him. "I'd like you there," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Why?" "Because you're my wife," he said. "And I should have said that more clearly 3 weeks ago when it mattered." It was not an apology. He was constitutionally incapable of the word sorry. She was becoming certain of that. But it was the closest structural approximation he was capable of. And she had learned enough about the architecture of this man to recognize load-bearing acknowledgement when she heard it. "I'll be there," she said. The meeting was tense in the specific way that Choi family meetings were tense, which is to say the danger was entirely invisible to anyone who hadn't learned the grammar. Hyunja presented her concerns with practiced reasonableness. 2 board members she had evidently prepared in advance asked supporting questions. Moojin answered everything with the flat precision that was his most powerful weapon in rooms like this. Then Jacinta fainted. It happened between one moment and the next with no theatrical warning. She was standing near the wall. She had refused a chair for reasons of positioning, and she simply went down. The room erupted in the way rooms do when something unexpected short-circuits a prepared narrative. Moojin was across the room in a speed she would not have predicted from a man of his deliberate energy. He was beside her before the security team, which said something about proximity and instinct that his carefully maintained public presentation did not. She came around within seconds. She was fine. She had not eaten enough that morning, a fact she would not admit to anyone, and the room had been too warm, and she had been standing for 2 hours on insufficient sleep. But the word pregnancy was in the room within minutes. She did not say it. He did not say it. But it moved through the air anyway. Unverified, impossible to contain, and within the hour it had reached every person in the building. This is the moment where you pause. And if you've ever stood in a room where people were deciding your story for you, where they were making up their minds about who you were before you finished being it, then you know what Jacinta was feeling when she heard those whispers. You know that specific loneliness. This community exists for people who've carried invisible weight in visible rooms. If this story is reaching you somewhere real, stay with us. Hit like, subscribe now. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been falsely accused of something and had to prove it alone? Not to vent, to be heard, because you deserve that. The test came back the following morning, negative. Hyunja heard the result through channels that should not have had access to the information, which told Jacinta something useful about the medical staff's loyalties. The stepmother's relief was almost visible through the walls. What Jacinta noticed was different. Moojin heard the result in his study alone before she did. By the time he came to find her, she had already been told, and she watched his face when he entered the room looking for her, before he saw her expression and recalibrated, and she saw something in the 2 seconds before the recalibration that she stored very carefully. He had not looked relieved. He had looked like a man who was processing loss. Just for those 2 seconds, mid in the space before his features arranged themselves back into controlled neutrality. He had looked like someone who had briefly held something and then been asked to put it back. She did not say anything about it. She said, "Negative." He said, "I know." They stood in the same room with something unspoken filling the space between them like barometric pressure before a storm. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "I don't mean medically," he said. She looked at him. He held her gaze without flinching, which was new. "No," she said honestly. "I'm not entirely all right." He nodded. He did not offer anything immediately, which in another man would have felt like inadequacy. In Mu-jin it felt like he was collecting himself to try harder than he naturally knew how. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "About the email," she said. "I've been investigating it myself." Something shifted in his face. He started to speak. "Don't," she said. "Don't take it from me. Let me finish." He closed his mouth. "I found the device ID from the access logs," she said. "I've been running it down quietly. I'm close." She paused. "I wanted you to know I have it, and I wanted to tell you myself. Not because I needed your permission, because you deserve to hear it from me directly." He was silent for a long moment. The city moved outside the windows, indifferent and enormous. "How long?" he asked. "A week, maybe less." "What do you need?" "Nothing from you yet," she said. "I'll ask when I do." He nodded again. Then with visible effort he said, "I should have—" He stopped. She waited. "At the board meeting," he said, 3 weeks ago when the email appeared, I should have—" "Yes," she said quietly, "you should have." He accepted that without defense, which was in its way everything. Mrs. and Park had been watching the Choi family for 19 years, with the patience and precision of a woman who understood that powerful households reveal themselves over time if you maintain the right quality of invisibility. She had liked and not liked various members of this family through various seasons. She had watched Mu-jin's father run his empire like a machine that had forgotten it was made of people. She had watched 3 marriages corrode in this building, and she had developed deep opinions about what happened to human beings when they were asked to sustain dignity inside systems designed to consume it. She liked Jacinta in the specific way she liked things that were both fragile and durable simultaneously, like old bridges and honest people. She also knew things. The thing she revealed on a Wednesday afternoon while bringing Jacinta a plate of sliced mango she had not requested was small, and the kind of small thing that is the load-bearing wall of a much larger structure. She sat across from Jacinta, which she now did as a matter of course, and said without preamble, "I saw Mr. Choi's cousin near your study 3 days before the email appeared." Jacinta went still. "He said he was collecting a document for Mr. Mu-jin," Mrs. Park continued. "I did not think about it at the time. I thought about it after." "Why are you telling me now?" Jacinta asked. "Because you're close," Mrs. E. Park said. "And I think you need the last piece." She set down the mango. "He was not collecting a document," she said. "There was no document. I checked the request log. There was nothing scheduled for that study, nothing that required his presence." Jacinta looked at her for a long moment. "You checked the log yourself?" she said. "I've had 19 years, Mrs. Park said. "I've learned where things are kept." The cousin's name was Choi Tae-young. He was 30 years old, and the son of Mu-jin's father's younger brother, positioned within the organization in a capacity that was officially described as strategic advisory and was more accurately described as expensive observation. He was not ambitious in the direct way that Yunja was ambitious. He was ambitious in the ambient way of men who feel owed something by families that never quite formalized the debt. And the device ID she had been tracking belonged to a secondary access account linked to administrative credentials that were not, on the surface, attached to Tae-young's name. But administrative credentials existed in systems, and systems had shadows, and Jacinta had spent years teaching students that every number, every variable, every sequence had an origin that could be traced if you were patient enough and stubborn enough and had nothing else to do at 2 in the morning. And she found the link on a Thursday. She sat with it for 6 hours before she decided what to do with it. She did not immediately go to Mu-jin. She went back through everything. The original email, the metadata she'd flagged weeks ago, the device log, the access credentials, the timeline of Tae Yang's movement in the household that Mrs. Park had quietly documented for her. She built the chain from origin to execution, made sure every link held, tested the weakest connections twice, and then she sat in the small breakfast room where she and Mrs. Park had shared tea countless times, with all of it laid out on her laptop screen. And she thought about what it meant. Tae Yang had not acted alone. The sophistication of the execution, the choice of the Shin organization's channel as the apparent destination, the timing relative to the board meeting, all of that required knowledge of the family's internal operations at a level Tae Yang had access to but not expertise in. Someone had designed the framework. He had been the hands. She thought about Director Kwon. She thought about all the quiet conversations, the soft voice, the kind eyes, the gentle placements of doubt about Mu-jin's loyalty and emotional range, the suggestion that she would need allies. The way he had made himself available to her at precisely the moments she was most vulnerable to available warmth. She opened a new document and began building a second chain. Seo-jun found her in the library again on the Friday evening, which she was beginning to think was not coincidental. "You look like someone who's finished something," he said. "I've finished the technical part," she said. "I'm working on the context now." He sat down. He had stopped asking permission, which she had decided to interpret as comfort rather than arrogance. "Is it Tae Yang?" he said. She looked at him. "I told you I had an instinct," he said. "Yes," she said. "It's Tae Yang." She paused. "And someone else." Seo-jun's expression shifted. Something moved through it that was not quite surprise. "Kwon," he said. She met his eyes. "I've had a feeling about him for months," Seo-jun said quietly. "Something not right about his positioning. He's too available, too comfortable. Advisors at his level shouldn't be spending time with—" He stopped. "With new family members?" "With maids," she said without heat. He had the decency to hold her gaze. I was wrong about that," he said. "The way I thought about that, I was wrong." She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you here, Seo-jun? Genuinely." He was quiet for a moment. "Because I spent a long time in this family assuming that loyalty meant blood," he said, "and blood hasn't been particularly loyal to me. Or to Mu-jin." He leaned forward. "And I watched my brother stand in a room full of people who wanted to see him humiliated, and I watched you stand beside him and not collapse. And I thought—" He stopped again. "I thought that was worth something." She looked at him for a long time. "It is worth something," she said. "But I'm going to need you to mean it at the moment it costs you something. Not just now when it's private and safe." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "Then be ready," she said. "Because I'm bringing this forward on Monday." She told Mu-jin that night. She came to the study. He was working because he was always working. But he looked up when she came in and set his pen down, which she had learned to read as the full extent of his undivided attention. She sat across from him and she laid out the entire structure. Tae Yang, the device, the credential chain, the timeline, the connection to Kwon, the pattern of quiet conversations, the design of the setup not to destroy her specifically, but to use her as the mechanism for pushing Mu-jin into annulment proceedings that would then be framed as evidence of emotional instability. which would be used at the board level to question his fitness for the leadership role Hyun-ja had been positioning herself to absorb. She spoke for 12 minutes. She did not use notes. She had memorized everything because memorization was how she ensured that nothing could be taken from her. He listened without interrupting, and his face did the thing it sometimes did when she gave him information that reconfigured a prior understanding. That very slight, controlled recalibration that she had learned was the equivalent in a man like Moo Jin of visible shock. When she finished, the room was quiet. "Kwon," he said finally. "Just the name, just the weight of it." "Yes," she said. He was still for a moment. "He was my father's closest advisor," he said. "I trusted him in the specific way you trust furniture, and without thinking about it." "I know," she said. "How long have you been investigating this?" "Since the day after the board meeting," she said. 3 weeks. He looked at her steadily. "You've had this for 3 weeks and you didn't—" "I wanted to be certain," she said. "And I wanted it to be mine." She held his gaze. "I earned it. The proof, the chain, all of it. I earned it the same way I earned that chess win. Through work, not through connection." She paused. You don't get to absorb that and present it as yours." Something moved through his face that was not hurt exactly, but was adjacent to it in a way that surprised her. "I wouldn't," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we go together Monday. Equal standing. My name on the presentation." "Yes," he said. She stood up. He stood up because he always stood when she did, which was one of the things about him that had consistently surprised her, on the small formal gestures of consideration that appeared in places she did not expect them. "Jacinta," he said. She stopped. "I looked for the truth," he said. "After the meeting. That night. I found enough to know the email wasn't right. I should have come to you immediately. I chose analysis over—" He stopped. He was having difficulty with the end of the sentence. "Over me," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. The word landed in the space between them. She looked at him, and he was standing very still with the expression of a man who had learned over decades to present stillness as strength, and was discovering at 36 that stillness was not always the appropriate response to the moment in front of him. "That's the first honest thing you've said to me since we got married," she said. He held her gaze. "Good night, Moo-jin," she said. She walked out. He stood in the study for a long time after she left, and the city turned outside his windows, and he thought about chess, about how every piece on the board had a defined range of movement, about how he had studied the game for 30 years and understood its architecture completely, about how she had beaten him anyway. Not through a move he hadn't seen coming, through a sequence he had seen and underestimated. He had made that error once. He did not intend to make it again. Monday arrived the way consequential days tend to, quietly from the outside, enormous from within. Jacinta wore the dress she had bought from the shop 3 blocks from her old apartment. The $200 dress she had worn to the wedding because she wanted to walk into that boardroom as the same woman who had entered this marriage. Not the transformed version, not the adapted version, the original. Mrs. Park saw her in the corridor and said nothing, just gave a single nod that carried the weight of 19 years. Seo Jun was waiting in the hallway outside the boardroom. He had arrived early, which Jacinta had not expected. He looked at her and straightened. "Ready?" he said. "Are you?" she said. "Yes," he said with the clarity of someone who had made the decision before arriving. Moo-jin appeared from the elevator with the lead attorney and 2 members of the technical security team who carried the evidence chain on a secured drive. He looked at Jacinta, and she looked at him, And for a moment in that corridor, something passed between them that was not words and not gestures and not the formal contractual relation they had arranged in front of a judge. It was just two people standing on the same side. "Together?" he said. "Together," she said. They walked in. The boardroom was full. Hyunja was there, composed and elegant and carrying the specific energy of a woman who had spent the weekend certain that Monday would be productive for her. Taeyang was there, a position near the back, which Jacinta noted. Director Kwon was seated near the head of the table, his habitual expression of gentle authority intact. She did not look at him directly when she entered. She looked at the presentation screen. She opened her laptop. She connected to the system. Moojin stood at the head of the table. "Before we begin the quarterly review," he said, "I want to address the security incident that was raised at the last meeting. New evidence has emerged. My wife will present it." The room shifted. Hyunja's expression did not change. She was too practiced for that. But something in her stillness changed quality. Jacinta stood. She presented the evidence chain in 11 minutes, which was exactly how long she had timed it. She did not editorialize. She did not perform. She presented data, sequence, and conclusion the way she had once presented mathematical proofs to teenagers who needed to understand that the universe operated on logic, and that logic was traceable if you were willing to follow it to its end. When she reached the conclusion, she showed the final connection. The device, the credentials, the timeline. The coordination between Taeyang's physical access to her study and the transmission of the manufactured email. Then she showed the second layer. Kwon's communication logs. I obtained through the security team's access to the household server. 3 months of interactions. The pattern of contact with Taeyang. The alignment with the timing of keyboard escalations. The room was very quiet. Taeyang looked at the screen and then at his hands. Director Kwon looked at Jacinta. His expression was still composed. She gave him credit for that. He had had years of practice maintaining his face. Then she turned to him directly for the first time. "You told me," she said, "that I would need allies in this house, that Moojin wouldn't always protect me." She held his gaze. "You were right about the first part. I did need allies." She paused. "I found Mrs. Park." The room did not quite understand that moment, but Mrs. Park, standing just inside the doorway with a tray she had manufactured as a reason for being present, allowed herself the smallest possible smile. "The evidence has been submitted to the board's independent auditors," Jacinta said. "The technical summary is available for review." She closed her laptop. "I'm done." She sat down. The room erupted. The intensity of what followed was the third major confrontation, and it split the room in ways that had been building for years. "Pick your side right now because this is where the story demands it." Hyunja stood up and said the family was being destabilized by an outsider. Seo-jun stood up and said the family was being destabilized by people who had been inside it for years. Taeyang said nothing, which is what people say when the evidence has already spoken for them. Director Kwon attempted a final performance of the wounded elder, invoking 30 years of service, invoking Moojin's father's memory, invoking the language of betrayal with the practiced fluency of a man who had been planning his exit narrative as a backup. Moojin stood at the head of the table and let it run for exactly 2 minutes, which was how long it took for the room to exhaust its initial energy. Then he spoke. "You chose a stranger over blood," Hyunja said when the other voices had run down. She said it with the quiet devastation of someone playing their final card. Moojin looked at his stepmother. He was very still. Around the room, everyone was watching him with the attention you give to the moment before something irrevocable. Blood betrayed me first, he said. The room absorbed that. He looked at Tai Yang. You will submit your resignation today. You will be escorted from the building by security at your convenience, which ends at 5 o'clock. He looked at Kwon. Your service contract is terminated effective immediately. The terms will be reviewed by the legal team for breach of fiduciary responsibility. He looked at Hyun-ja last and held her gaze for several seconds. The accounts you froze will be reviewed by the independent auditors along with everything else, when whatever the auditors find will determine what happens next. She stared at him. You're destroying this family. No, he said quietly. I'm finding out what was left of it. He sat down. The meeting continued because meetings always continue. Business is indifferent to the human wreckage of its participants. Numbers were reviewed. Reports were acknowledged. The auditor assignments were formalized. It lasted another 40 minutes. When it ended and the room emptied, Jacinta sat in her chair until most people had left. She was very tired. Not dramatically tired, not emotionally exhausted in a way that required performance. Just the deep, specific tiredness of someone who had been carrying weight at a sustained pace and had now put it down. Seo-jun paused beside her on his way out. Well, he said. Yes, she said. He looked like he wanted to say more and didn't have the words yet. He nodded and left. She thought that was probably the beginning of something, in with him. Not friendship immediately, but something possible. She was gathering her laptop when Moo-jin appeared beside her. She hadn't heard him approach, which said something about how tired she was. He sat in the chair next to hers, which was unusual. He generally stood. The act of sitting beside her rather than across from her registered somewhere. Are you all right? He asked. You asked me that before, she said. I said no. I'm asking again. She looked at him. That he was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Open in a way that cost him something, which made it real in a way that the controlled versions of his face were not. I will be, she said. I need a day. He nodded. They sat in the empty boardroom for a moment side by side, looking at the presentation screen that was now dark. You didn't need me in there, he said. No, she said. I know, he said. I was aware of that. He paused. I was there because I wanted to be, not because you needed me to be. She turned to look at him. That's different, she said. Yes, he said. I know that too. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the dark screen. The chess thing, she said. When you made the promise. Yes. Did you mean it? She asked. At the actual moment you said it. Before you had time to decide you meant it. He was quiet for a while. Long enough that she almost withdrew the question. I said it, he finally said. Because for 40 minutes on a chessboard you were completely honest with me. You didn't know who I was or you didn't care, and no one is ever just honest with me. He paused. I wanted to keep that somewhere I could find it again. She sat with that for a long moment. That is the second honest thing you've said to me since we got married, she said. Something shifted in him. How many do I need? He said. And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, something that was almost, nearly dangerously close to warmth. More than 2, she said. I'll work on it, he said. She almost laughed. She didn't, quite, but he saw the edge of it. He almost smiled, fully this time, nearly there. The weeks that followed were not simple because nothing in that house had ever been simple. And reconstruction is slower and more painstaking than destruction. The auditors moved through the accounts. Hyun-ja retained a legal team and contested the findings in the measured, procedural way of someone who was not done. Tae-young was gone. Kwon was gone. The family structure fractured began the slow process of reorganizing around the fractures rather than pretending they weren't there. Seo-jun moved into a more active position within the organization, partly because the removal of several parties had created space and partly because he made a decision quietly and without announcement to be useful. He checked in with Jacinta twice a week in the way that people check in when they are doing penance without calling it penance. She accepted the check-ins and the penance without mentioning either. She expanded her tutoring. 4 students became 7. She found an organization that placed qualified immigrant educators in supplemental teaching positions and registered with them on a Tuesday morning with the specific satisfaction of a person returning to something true about themselves. She did not stop living in the penthouse. She did not soften her position. She did not become the decorative arrangement in a cold room that Mujin's father's wives had become. She moved through the building with the same direct economy of motion she had brought to every space she had ever occupied, and she expected to be spoken to like a person, and mostly, increasingly, she was. The small moments accumulated. He brought her coffee one morning without being asked, which meant he had noticed how she took it, which meant he had been paying attention to her in the specific quiet way that is more intimate than declarations. She found a chess app installed on the tablet she used for work, which she had not installed herself. There was no note. There was no explanation. She opened it and found a game in progress, white pieces having made their opening move. She made her response and set the tablet down. The next morning, the white pieces had moved again, and they played 3 games that way over a week, through a device passed back and forth without acknowledgement, like a conversation being conducted in a language they had both forgotten to make complicated. She won the first game. He won the second. The third was ongoing. The evening it finally broke open genuinely was not dramatic. It was the absence of drama that made it real. She was sitting in the garden, at the small enclosed space off the east side of the penthouse that she had claimed in her second week, because no one else seemed to use it and she needed somewhere that was entirely hers. She was reading. The city was below and around her, making its perpetual indifferent noise. He came and sat beside her, not across from her. Beside her. In the other garden chair that she had never seen anyone sit in before. She didn't look up immediately. He didn't say anything for a while. I looked up your university, he said finally. Again. This time I looked up the faculty you would have been part of if you'd stayed. She looked up. There's a visiting researcher position, he said. Through a partnership the university here has with your former institution. It opened last month. He paused. I thought you should know about it. She looked at him for a long moment. He was looking at the city. You're not offering to get it for me, she said. No, he said. You'd destroy me if I tried. She almost laughed again, closer this time. I'm telling you it exists, he said, because you're qualified for it, and because... He stopped. She waited. Because watching you teach, he said, through the window of the library when you didn't know I was there. You were different, the way you were with your students. He paused. That's who you are when nobody's watching you be anything else. She looked at him for a long time. He still wasn't looking at her, and what she understood was how he was able to say it. Mujin, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. He held her gaze. For what, specifically? For paying attention, she said. That's rarer than you think. Something settled in his face, something that had been held for a long time. Some sustained tension that lived in the architecture of him, shifted slightly, like a building deciding the wind is not a threat. He looked back at the city. She looked back at her book, and they sat there together as the light changed and neither of them spoke for a long time, and the silence was not distance. It was not the first silence. There had been many silences between them. But this one had a different quality. It was not absence. It was the presence of two people who had separately earned the right to stop explaining themselves and simply be. She turned a page. He stayed. If you've made it to this moment in the story, you already know something about yourself. You stayed through the betrayal, the loneliness, the slow, terrible work of two people trying to reach each other across years of learning not to need anyone. This channel is for people who understand that love isn't the easy part. Trust is. Dignity is. Choosing someone when it costs you something. That's the whole thing. If this community is one you want to be part of, subscribe now and tell us in the comments. What did this story make you feel? Not think. Feel. Because someone out there is reading your comment tonight and needs to know they're not the only one who's been in a room where no one stood up for them. Be that voice. Stay with us.